What if the smallest kindness, the teaching of a girl her letters, one crooked stick scratch in the dust at a time, could reach further than any rifle and undo a whole town's fear before that town ever knew it was afraid? What if a poor rancher with more books than cattle looked across a river at a chief's daughter and saw not an enemy handed down to him by his fathers, but a mind as quick as spring water, waiting only for a door to be opened? He opened it. He never asked for anything in return, and that is exactly why what her father gave in return became a legend. If a story like this one warms something in you, take a moment now to like this video, to subscribe to Saddleback Stories, and to tap that notification bell so the next quiet tale finds its way to your fire. Now, ride back with me to the Arizona Territory of 1883, when the land was wide and the fear was wider. And let's begin. The territory in those years was a country of two silences that did not speak to one another. On the ranches and in the dusty little town of Coyote Wells, the settlers kept their doors barred and their children close, and they told the old stories at night, the ones that grew teeth in the retelling, until every Apache who ever rode a ridgeline became a shadow with a knife. Out beyond the mesa, along the folds of the hills where the hidden springs kept the grass green when everything else went to bone, the Apache kept their own counsel and their own grief, for they had buried more of their people than the settlers ever counted, and they had learned that a white man's promise was often written on paper they could not read and could not therefore trust. So the two peoples lived warily apart, close enough to see one another's smoke, far enough that the line between them felt as fixed as the mountains. Most on both sides accepted that line the way they accepted weather. It simply was. You did not argue with it any more than you argued with a hailstorm. You only bowed your head and waited for it to pass over, and it never did pass over. Because fear, unlike weather, does not move on unless a person moves it. Now and then, though, there came a man or a woman who would not accept the line, who looked at it the way a stubborn calf looks at a fence, as a thing made by hands, and therefore a thing that hands might one day take down. Such people were rare, and they were mocked and they were watched, for a town that has organized its whole heart around being afraid does not love the neighbor who is not. It fears him most of all, because his calm is an accusation, and every easy word he says to the wrong sort of person sounds, to frightened ears, like a door being left unlatched at night. And yet those few held on, quietly, without banners, doing small right things where they could, and it was into this narrow, watchful world, this country of two silences, that our story rides, carried not on a war pony and not behind a badge, but on the sway-backed back of a tired plow horse, beneath a young man who owned little in this world but the letters he could read, and the stubborn, unfashionable habit of judging a soul by its character, and not by the blood it was born into. His name was Elias Warren, and he was not yet 30, though the sun and the work had already written a few early lines at the corners of his eyes. He had come into the ranch the hard way, which is to say by burying the people who built it. His father had broken the first ground and broken his own body doing it, and had gone into the earth one dry autumn when Elias was still more boy than man. His mother had held on a few winters longer, teaching school lessons at the kitchen table by lamplight to a son who had no other schoolhouse for miles, and then a fever took her too, quiet as a candle pinched between two fingers, and left Elias alone with a hard ranch, a poor string of cattle, a leaking roof, and a single shelf of books. Those books were the one true wealth she left him. Other men in the territory measured their fortune in head of cattle, or in acres, or in the depth of the well they had struck. Elias measured his in the worn spines lined up above the hearth, a primer, a Bible, a book of maps, 2 novels soft as chamois from being read, and a slim volume of poems his mother had loved. He read them all so many times he could have recited them in the dark, and often did, to the cattle, because a lonely man will talk to whatever will hold still. The town thought him odd for it. They thought him odder still for his other habit, the one that made them shake their heads and call him, not unkindly, but not kindly either, too trusting. For Elias would take a man at his word until the man gave him reason not to, and he would do the same for a woman, and he would do it, scandalously, without first asking what people that man or woman had come from. He had hired a drifter no one else would touch, and the drifter had stayed honest. He had traded fair with a Mexican sheepman the town shunned, and the trade had held. Where his neighbors saw a person's origin and stopped looking, Elias kept looking, all the way down to the character underneath, because his mother had taught him at that lamplit table that the Almighty did not make some souls to be feared on sight and others to be trusted, but made them all one clay, to be known one at a time, slow. The way you gentle a green colt. It was a slow and unprofitable way to live, and it had won him more mockery than money, but it had also given him, though he did not yet know it, the one pair of eyes in that whole frightened country that could look across a river at a stranger and see, first and before all else, a person worth the trouble of knowing. Her name was Nayeli, and she was the daughter of Chief Tazi, whose word carried weight from the mesa to the far hills, and she carried herself the way her father carried his, straight-backed, unhurried, certain of her own ground. She was proud, but it was not the brittle pride of someone with something to prove. It was the settled pride of a woman who knew her worth and did not require a stranger's opinion to confirm it. She had grown skilled in the things her people valued most. She knew the herbs of the hills the way Elias knew his books, which root broke a fever, which leaf crushed and bound, drew the heat from a wound, which berry was food and which was death, and she could gentle a frightened horse with her hands and her low voice better than any man in the band, so that even a wild-eyed mustang would drop its head and lean its heavy jaw into her palm, as though she were kin. She had lost people too, more than one, to sickness and to the long troubles between her nation and the newcomers, and she might have grown bitter as alkali water, but she had watched bitterness eat other hearts hollow, and she had decided, young, that she would not feed it hers. So she kept her calm, and she kept her grief in its own quiet room, and she went on. But there was one hunger in her that her people's ways could not feed, and it had been growing in her for years. It was the settlers' written words. She had seen the power in them, and the wound of them on the worst day of her girlhood, the day the men had come with a paper and had spread it on a wagon tail and had made marks on it, and had told her father and the elders what the marks said, and her father, who could read a storm and a horse and a man's face but could not read those small black tracks, had listened and trusted and made his own mark below theirs. Later the paper meant something other than what the men had said, and land that had been theirs was theirs no longer, and there was no arguing with it, because the truth of it lived in those marks, and the marks were a country her people had been shut out of, walled away from as surely as from any valley held by guns. Nayeli had stood there and understood, with a cold clarity that never left her, that a people who could not read the papers that governed their own lives were a people forever at the mercy of whoever held the pen, and she had promised herself, though she told no one, that one day she would learn to read the marks. She only did not yet know who under that wide sky would ever be willing to teach her. It was the river that brought them together, as rivers will, for water gathers the thirsty of every kind. There was a bend below Elias's land where the current slowed over pale stones and the cottonwoods leaned close, and it was neutral ground of a sort, the way water often is. His cattle drank there, and so sometimes did the horses of Tazi's band. And one morning in the green part of the year, Elias came down to mend a place in the bank and found Nayeli already there, kneeling among the reeds, washing a wound on a yearling colt's foreleg with a handful of bruised leaves. Neither of them ran. That was the whole beginning. If a beginning can be so small, neither of them ran. He saw the colt's hurt and the sure way her hands worked it, and he crouched a little way off and offered, without words at first, the strip of clean cloth from his own pocket. And she considered it, and him for a long moment, and then took it. They did not have many words in common that day, but he had brought a book down to the river, as he often did, meaning to read in the shade while the cattle drank, and she saw it in his hand, and her eyes went to it, and stayed, and something in her face changed, a door opening the width of a finger. He saw the look. He knew it, because he loved the thing she was looking at. And so, not knowing what else to do, he did the simplest thing a reading man can do. He smoothed a patch of damp sand with his palm, and he took up a stick, and he drew a single letter, large and plain, and he said its name aloud, and then he made the sound it carried, and he looked up at her to see if he had given offense. He had not. She leaned closer. She took the stick from his hand. That was the moment, more than any other, the taking of the stick, and she copied the mark below his, careful as tracking, and she said the sound back to him, and the river went on talking over the stones, as though nothing at all had happened, when in fact the line that ran through the whole territory had just been crossed by a stick and a letter in the sand. They met that way through the turning weeks, in the dirt at first, letter by letter, A and its long and short breath, then B, then the rest, until she could scratch her whole name of sounds along the bank. Then he brought the primer, his mother's own, and let her hold it, and turned the soft pages, and they sat a careful arm's length apart with the little book between them like a shared fire. Later still he brought a slate and a nub of chalk, so she could carry the practice home unseen, and she filled it and wiped it and filled it again by her own fire at night, telling no one. Word by word the country of the marks opened to her, and somewhere in those weeks of dust and chalk and low patient voices, the silent respect between them warmed into something neither of them named aloud, something as unhurried and certain as the river itself, that deepened every time their hands nearly touched over the same page, and did not quite, and did not need to. A secret kept along a river is still a secret kept in the world, and the world has long ears. It was the town that found them out, though not at the river. It was in the general store at Coyote Wells, on a bright, hard afternoon, when Nayeli came in at her father's word to trade beadwork and cured hides for flour and salt, as her people sometimes did, keeping their eyes down and their business short, because the room always went cold when they entered it. That day the storekeeper, a sharp man named Hollis, who counted a stranger's ignorance as part of his profit, had pushed a paper across the counter. A trade contract, he called it, for a season's worth of hides against goods, and he read it aloud to her fast and friendly, the way the men had once read the treaty to her father, and the words he spoke were fair, and the words on the page were not. And Nayeli, who 3 months before could not have told one mark from another, let her eyes fall to the paper and, quietly, without heat, began to read it aloud herself. She read the real words, the ones about quantities halved and prices doubled, and a clause that bound her people to bring twice the hides for half the flour, and her voice did not rise and did not shake. It only went on, plain and clear, letter by letter, in the language of the marks, until she reached the bottom and looked up. The store had gone silent. Every soul in it had turned. A frontier town could carry many pictures of an Apache woman in its head, but there was no room in any of them for this one. A young Apache woman in buckskin and beadwork, reading a white man's contract back to a white man, and catching him in the lie of it, calm as you please. Hollis's face went the color of tallow. Nobody spoke. Then, all at once, everybody did, and the talk broke over the town like water over a failed dam. On the settlers' side, it ran to fear and offense. Who taught her? And why? And what did it mean that the walls were not as high as they had believed? On the Apache side, when it reached them, it ran to unease of a different kind, a daughter of the chief learning the newcomer's witchery of marks, meeting a settler man in secret by the river. What was the world coming to, and where would such a thing end? And in the middle of both storms stood Nayeli, who had not raised her voice, and Elias, whose name came out soon enough, standing a little straighter under the weight of the town's stare than he ever had before. Because for the first time in his life, the thing he was mocked for had done a plain and public good, and he found, somewhat to his surprise, that he was not sorry. What the reading had truly unlocked did not come clear until a few days later, and when it came, it changed the shape of the story in the town's mind for good. For Nayeli, having tasted what the marks could do, went home and asked her father to bring out the old papers, the treaty paper and the land papers, the ones that had cost them the Green Valley years before, and she sat by the fire and read them, slowly, all the way through, the true words and not the spoken ones. And in the reading she found what the men had buried in the middle, past the fine phrases, a boundary described not by the ridgeline everyone had believed, but by a line further east, so that a whole shoulder of good-watered land, the very ground with the hidden spring, had never in truth been signed away at all. It had been taken by a lie of the pen, held only by her people's inability to read the pen. She read it twice to be sure, and then she read it to her father, and Chief Tazi listened to his daughter give him back a piece of his country out of a stack of marks he had always taken for an enemy. And he was quiet a long time. Word of this, too, worked its way to the town, and it did a strange thing to the way the people there had learned to see her. They had a picture, worn smooth by long use, of the simple Apache girl who came in with hides and could be dealt with quick and cheap, and that picture would not hold anymore. Because a simple girl does not read a decade-old land grant and find the buried clause that a territorial clerk missed. Slowly, grudgingly, in 2s and 3s at the store, and the well, and the church steps, the town began to understand that they had never once looked at her, that behind the buckskin was the chief's own daughter, raised at the center of her people's council, with a mind like a good knife, and that she had been that person all along. On every one of the mornings they had watched her keep her eyes down at the counter, and thought they saw the whole of her. It shamed some of them. Quietly, it frightened others worse than before. But it made her real to them in a way she had not been, and a real person is a much harder thing to fear in the old blind way than a shadow is. And through it all Elias said little. He did not crow that he had taught her, or claim any part of what she had found. He only went on with his work, and went on down to the river when he could, and let the truth do the slow labor that truth does, which is to make the frightened, one by one, a little less afraid of the thing they had never troubled to know. Then came the season of hard looks, and it fell on them from both sides at once, as such seasons do. In Coyote Wells the talk soured for a while before it sweetened. There were men who said a white man teaching an Apache to read was a danger to them all, that knowledge in the wrong hands was a loaded gun, and they said it to Elias's face at the store and behind his back at the saloon. And some stopped trading with him, and his poor ranch grew poorer. And out at the settlement it was no easier for Nayeli, for there were elders who loved her, and loved her father, and yet mistrusted the whole business, the marks that had cheated them once, the settler man who came smiling by the river, the daughter of the chief drawn into the world that had done them so much harm. They did not forbid it out of respect for Tazi, but they watched with grave faces, and they spoke their doubts to him plainly, and a chief must weigh the fears of his elders as carefully as any treaty. It would have been the easiest thing in the world, in that season, for Elias and Nayeli to answer anger with anger, for him to throw the town's cruelty back in its teeth, for her to meet the elders' doubt with a proud girl's defiance. They did neither. That was the whole of their strength, and it confounded everyone. When men would not trade with him, Elias did not curse them. He mended the storekeeper Hollis's broken corral fence one evening without being asked, and without saying why. Because the work needed doing, and he was near. And Hollis, who had cheated her and been caught, stood in his doorway and watched a man he had wronged fix his fence for nothing, and something in him began, slowly, to turn. When the elders spoke their doubts, Nayeli did not argue. She brought her reading to their service instead, sitting with them through long evenings, reading them every paper that touched their people, warning them of a bad clause before they marked it, so that the very skill they feared began, week by week, to guard them. The two of them simply kept doing right, quietly, in the direction of the people who mistrusted them, and there is almost nothing a fearful heart can do against that. Anger, it can answer. Argument, it can answer, but steady, unrewarded kindness, offered again and again to the very ones who withhold their welcome, is a slow water that wears down any stone, and the town of Coyote Wells and the elders of Tazi's band were, in the end, only stone. When Elias judged that the time was right, and he took long over the judging, because he meant to do the thing properly or not at all, he did not send word, and he did not go by the back way, and he did not go empty-handed. He gathered what a poor man could gather that would still speak of respect, a good saddle he had kept oiled and whole through every lean year, a bolt of fine cloth traded for at cost, a fresh broken young horse gentled by his own hands, and a book, wrapped in soft hide, one of his mother's own, because he had nothing he valued more, and that was the point of giving it. He rode out to the settlement in the clean light of morning, alone, openly, so that any who wished could see him come. And when he reached the place where Chief Tazi sat among his elders, he got down from his horse, and he took off his hat. He stood bareheaded in the sun before the chief and the gray-haired men around him, and he laid down his gifts, and he did not rush his words. He said that he had come to ask for Nayeli, and that he knew what he was, and what he was not, a poor man with a hard ranch and little to offer but his hands and his word. He said he had not taught her the marks to make her his. He had taught her because a bright mind ought not to be walled out of anything, and he would go on believing that whatever they answered him today. And then he made his promise, and he made it carefully, because he had thought long on it. He did not promise to take her into his world. He promised to honor hers, to learn her people's ways as she had learned his marks, to bring their children up knowing both, to keep faith with the traditions of her father's house as he would keep faith with his own, and never to ask her to become less of what she was in order to be his wife. He asked nothing of the chief but the honor of being weighed. The elders were quiet. The whole settlement had gone still to listen, and word had carried too, so that more than a few from the town had come out to see how the strange business would end, standing off at a respectful distance, hats in hand, more curious than hostile now. Elias stood in the center of it all, a small poor man before a great chief, hat over his heart, and he waited to be judged, having promised no one anything in return for a yes, and having, by that very emptiness of expectation, told the truest thing about himself that any words could have told. Chief Tazi rose. He was a broad and weathered man with a stillness in him, deeper than the hills, and he looked at Elias for a long time before he spoke, the way a man reads weather off a far ridge. Then he said that in his father's house there was a rule, old as the people, handed down and never written on any paper, because it did not need to be, that you may know the whole of a man's character by the respect he offers where no reward is promised him. A man who is generous to the powerful, Tazi said, is only trading. A man who is kind to the one who can give him nothing back is showing you his heart, for there is nothing else it could be. He said he had watched this settler for many turns of the moon. He had watched him teach his daughter the marks and ask no payment. He had watched him mend the fence of the man who had wronged him. He had watched him ride out today, poor and alone and bareheaded, and lay down his best possessions and promise not to take a daughter away, but to honor a people, and ask in return only to be measured. And Tazi said that by the rule of his fathers, there was nothing left to measure. Then the chief did the thing that the whole territory would tell of for a generation after. He turned so that the townspeople could see him as well as his own, and he raised his voice so that all of them heard it, and he gave. He gave first the deed to the green valley with the hidden spring, the very land that Nayeli's reading had proven was never lawfully signed away, set down now in the marks the settlers themselves trusted, so that no clerk's lie could ever take it again. And he gave it into the keeping of his daughter and the man she would marry, protected ground for both peoples to share. He gave, second, a fine herd out of his own horses, enough to lift the hard ranch out of its poverty forever. And he gave, last and greatest, the thing no paper holds, he named Elias Warren, kin, publicly, son to the chief, calling him by that word in front of the town that had mocked him for a fool, and folding a poor settler into the house of Tazi before every watching eye. And the town of Coyote Wells fell silent. It was not the silence of the store this time, the shock of a girl who could read. It was the deeper silence of a whole people caught out in their own smallness, for they had come to see charity begged, or a fool humbled, and instead they had watched a chief they had taught their children to fear act with more dignity and more open-handed generosity than the town had shown any soul in 20 years, and there was not one among them who could meet his eye. The line that had run through the territory did not fall that day with a shout. It simply had no more ground to stand on, and the people knew it, and hung their heads, and were, every one of them, ashamed. They were wed beneath the cottonwoods at the river bend where the first letter had been drawn in the sand, in the good part of the year when the water ran clear and the leaves threw their moving shade over everyone. It was a wedding the territory had never seen the like of. Cowboys stood beside warriors along the bank, awkward at first, hats in their hands, and the elders of Tazi's band stood among the settlers of Coyote Wells, and old Hollis the storekeeper came, and stood near the back, and wept without quite knowing why. Nayeli's people sang their songs, and Elias's neighbors sang theirs, and the two sounds did not fight, but layered, the way the river layered over its stones, and for one afternoon at least the two silences of the territory became one music. But a wedding is a promise, not a proof, and the proof came after, as it always does, in a hard hour. Within the year, a land speculator out of the territorial seat filed a claim on the Green Valley, waving papers of his own, betting as such men always bet that no one who lived on the land could read the fraud in his filing. He had not counted on Nayeli. She rode to the county court with her deed and his claim both, and she read them side by side before the judge, and she laid bare the false survey and the forged date the way she had once laid bare Hollis's contract in the store, quiet and clear and letter by letter, until the speculator's case fell to pieces on the table in front of him. And when a hard winter came behind that hard summer, and fever moved through Coyote Wells, it was Nayeli's other knowledge that answered. The herbs of the hills. The roots that broke a fever, and the leaves that drew the heat from a wound, carried freely into the houses of the very people who had once gone cold when she entered their store, nursing settler children through the long nights beside their mothers. Her reading saved the town's land, and her people's medicine saved the town's children, and the fearful, who had built their whole hearts around keeping her kind out, found those hearts unbuilt in their hands, and did not want them back the old way. One by one they came to her, and to Elias, not with suspicion now but with need, and then with thanks, and at last with something that could only be called love, and they embraced the family they had been so certain, so recently, that they should fear. The years ran on the way the river did, patient and unhurried, and they made of that green valley something the old fearful territory would not have believed possible. The hard ranch was hard no longer. Tazi's horses had bred true, and the grass by the hidden spring never failed. And Elias and Nayeli built their life there in the open, welcoming any soul who came, settler or Apache or the wandering poor of any blood, judging each one, as Elias had always judged, slow and one at a time, all the way down to the character underneath. And in the middle of it, where the two peoples met, they raised a school, a plain building of adobe and cottonwood beams, with a slate for every child and a shelf of books along the wall, Elias's mother's among them. And in it the children of the ranchers and the children of the band sat side by side and learned their letters together, the same A drawn large and plain that a young man had once scratched in wet sand for a chief's daughter who would not run. They learned the marks as one people, so that no clerk's lie and no speculator's forged date would ever again find a child of that valley who could not read it for what it was. And the story of how it all began, the poor rancher and the chief's daughter, the letters in the dust, the humble ask with the hat over the heart, and above all the chief's great gift that silenced a whole ashamed town, passed into legend, told at firesides across the territory and beyond it, kept alive because people need, in every hard age, to be reminded of the one thing it proves, that fear is a wall built by hands, and kindness is a hand that can take it down, one patient letter at a time. So let me leave the telling with you now, and ask you plainly, wherever you are sitting as you listen, is there a line in your own life, drawn long ago by other people's fear, that one small unrewarded kindness of yours could begin to rub away? Think on it. And when you have, tell me down in the comments where in this wide world you are watching from tonight, and what small kindness you mean to offer. I read every one. If this story warmed you, give it a like so another heart can find it. And subscribe to Saddleback Stories, and I will keep a place for you here by the fire, for the next tale is already saddled and waiting.